Testing 1, 2, 3. Hi everyone, and welcome to another Woke Wednesday. This podcast was created to shed light on different societal issues which have been at the forefront of public discourse through one of the most divisive times in American history. More so, it was created with the intent of allowing those who have often been neglected, shunned, or misunderstood to have a chance to share their experiences and thoughts. I hope this dialogue encourages critical conversation and activism amongst all listeners. And I hope you'll tell all your friends about it and share it on your social platforms. Last month, Empire actor Jussie Smollett returned to his Chicago home at 2 a.m. where he said he was beaten and drenched with bleach. During the attack, Smollett reported that the perpetrators yelled racist and homophobic comments and claimed that this is Make America Great Again country. His assailants also tied a noose around his neck during the beating. Like expected, many celebrities, fans, and people in general rushed to Smollett's defense and wished him well in the midst of what we all perceive to be a hate crime.
I'm Robin Roberts in New York. Musician and actor Jussie Smollett sat down with me for his first interview since that night in Chicago. Smollett told me how he's doing now and responds to those who doubt his account.
I'm pissed off.
What is it that has you so angry? Is it the attackers?
It's the attackers, but it's also the attacks. It's like, at first it was a thing of like, listen, if I tell the truth, then that's it, because it's the truth. Mm-hmm. Then it became a thing of like, oh, how can you doubt that? Like, how do you not believe that? It's the truth. And then it became a thing of like, oh, it's not necessarily that you don't believe that this is the truth. You don't even want to see the truth.
What happened that night, Jussie?
When I landed in Chicago, and Frank Gatson, who's like my uncle, and he's also my creative director, and he picked me up. And then we got back to the apartment. There was no food. And so I went out to Walgreens thinking that they were 24 hours and to have a smoke. Walgreens was closed. So I called him up and I said, hey, I'm gonna run to Subway, which was across the street, and I'm gonna get a salad. Do you want anything? I went to the Subway and got the order. During that time, I texted my manager thinking that he was still in Australia because he was on an Australian tour with one of his other clients. Mm-hmm. And I said, yo, call me when you can. He called me immediately. And while he was on the phone, I heard, as I was crossing the intersection, I heard Empire. And I don't answer to Empire. My name ain't Empire. And I didn't answer. I kept walking, and then I heard Empire. So I turned around and I said, the did you just say to me? And I see the attacker masked, and he said, this MAGA country punches me right in the face.
Following the attack, different reports and speculations came out surrounding the entire incident, which Smollett used one of his concerts to address some of the misconceptions in the media. He clarified that his ribs weren't broken, only cracked. He wasn't hospitalized, he just went to the doctor himself, and that he fought the fuck back. Of course, cheers erupted and people continued showing support for the actor. He later, on his first on-air interview since the attack, expressed very emotionally a recount of the incident and how he's pissed off at the questioning people were doing concerning the validity of the attack. Whew, child. Then, an unexpected twist that no one was expecting came out. Evidence came out that the two alleged assailants were a Nigerian brother duo that acted alongside Smollett on Empire. Now, obviously this is a surprising turn of events because the case seemed to replicate that of a hate crime, which would indicate it was committed by someone of another race, not someone of the same race. Then, news got even crazier, and different news reports came out that said Smollett allegedly paid the actors to orchestrate the entire thing because evidence came out that he was dissatisfied with his salary, and Fox's reaction to the racist and homophobic letter that was sent to him on the Empire set. Of course, Smollett reportedly denies these allegations, but the Chicago Police Department is remaining adamant about this fact and reports that this letter was written by Smollett himself. However, the FBI is conducting forensic analysis of the letter to determine its origin. Obviously, this entire story has turned into a chain of events that I, along with many others, did not expect. The question that I have in the midst of all of this is, who do we believe, Jussie Smollett or the Chicago Police? The Chicago Police has a notorious history of discriminating against people of color. For instance, the 2017 shooting of Laquan McDonald sparked outrage specifically from the Black community because video footage showed the teen with his back turned and walking away from the officer when he was shot in the back 16 times. Initially, the officer wasn't charged, but after the video was released, that changed. The same day the video was released, Jason Van Dyke was charged and found guilty of second-degree murder. Yet, he was only sentenced to 6.5 years. I truly still don't know who or what to believe at this point because so much information is constantly pouring in surrounding this case. Yet, I do know that violence against the LGBTQ community and the Black community is in no way, shape, or form something to be trivialized. Actual hate crimes happen to real people. So, if Smollett did use this only as a publicity stunt, then honestly, shame on him. And he deserves some sort of punishment. Although, I still don't know what I think that appropriate punishment should be. It's also interesting because we're seeing kind of the court of a public opinion come to light with this case. Different voices that we should be listening to and recognizing are being heard, honestly, because of this case. These voices have come in the form of accusations over the past few years through the Me Too and Time's Up movements, among others. And this instance is significant, but because it is one of the few high-profile hate crime allegations that have surfaced in the public space. Of course, Smollett's voice deserves to be heard, but it is becoming more complicated to validate these allegations without proof. And if he did in fact make this up, then he's undermining minority voices all over this country, making it okay to not take these type of allegations seriously. Ultimately, I hope the truth comes out sooner rather than later, because the public deserves to know, did this actually happen or was it a publicity stunt? Now, switching subjects. If you didn't know, a 2015 study reported that out of 55 countries, America has the largest wealth inequality gap. This gap doesn't just include the $63.5 trillion in public wealth, but property and investments held too. Poverty in America has long been a major problem that will take years to not just be addressed, but fixed. To be poor in America is a struggle that far too many Americans can identify with, myself included. But what does it mean to be poor exactly? Well, in 2016, approximately 40.6 million people lived in poverty according to the official poverty measure. The official poverty measure compares a family's household income to a set poverty threshold, or a minimum amount of income needed to cover basic needs. But there are a few major shortcomings of how the official poverty measure actually measures poverty. One, it doesn't reflect modern expenses and resources. Two, it doesn't vary by geographical location, cost of living. Of course, there are huge variations between states. Like, the cost of living for New York City is extremely higher than the cost of living for Georgia, but it doesn't account for that. And it's not adjusted for changes in standards of living over time. So, does this number above accurately represent the actual amount of people living in poverty in the US? Probably not. It's probably much higher. But even so, you have to wonder how it is that a country that prides itself on freedom and opportunity could allow for so many of its inhabitants to live in such primitive conditions.
How have we gotten to a point where we can have high corporate profits when businesses can be doing so well,
Right.
but the workers don't necessarily share in that prosperity?
Well, this has been at least a 3-decade-long trend. Now, there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. Some of it has to do with technology and entire sectors being eliminated. Travel agents, bank tellers, a lot of middle management. A lot of it has to do with globalization. The rest of the world's catching up. Post-World War II, we had just some enormous structural advantages because our competitors had been devastated by war. And we had also made investments that put us ahead of the curve, whether in education or infrastructure. Those advantages went away at the same time as workers increasingly had less leverage because of changes in labor laws. You combine all that stuff and it's put workers in a tougher position. So some people who just control enormous amounts of wealth, we don't resent their success. On the other hand, just as a practical matter, you're going to have problems making sure that we're investing enough in the common good to be able to move forward.
Does this put us in a place long term where redistribution becomes, in a sense, a positive good in and of itself?
Well, that's always been the case, though. I don't think that's entirely new. I mean, the fact of the matter is that relative to our post-war history, taxes now are not particularly high or particularly progressive compared to what they were, say, in the late 50s or the 60s. There's always been this notion that for a country to thrive, there are some things, as Lincoln said, that we do better together than we can do for ourselves. Whether that's building roads or setting up effective power grids or making sure that we've got high quality public education and the teachers are paid enough. The market will not cover those things, and we've got to do them together. Basic research falls in that category. So that's always been true. I think that part of what's changed is that a lot of that burden for making sure that the pie was broadly shared took place before government even got involved. If you have stronger unions, then you had higher wages. If you had a corporate culture that felt a sense of place and commitment, so that the CEO, they felt a real affinity for the community to reinvest in that community and to be seen as a good corporate citizen. Today, what you have is quarterly earning reports. You have compensation levels for CEOs that are tied directly to those quarterly earnings. You've got international capital that is demanding short-term profits. And so what happens is that a lot of the distributional questions that used to be handled in the marketplace through decent wages or healthcare or defined benefit pension plans, those things all are eliminated. And the average employee, the average worker, doesn't feel any benefit.
There are 9 different factors that are accounted for the causes of poverty. One is inadequate access to clean water and nutritious food. For example, Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean water, and the 23.5 million people that live in food deserts. I can definitely account for a food desert because I literally work in one. The access to nutritious food around here is minimal at best. Another factor is little or no access to livelihoods and jobs, especially after being imprisoned. The chances of finding a job with a livable wage is significantly lower for those that have been incarcerated, and even lower for those that have been incarcerated and are Black or brown. Another factor is conflict. If you haven't been following the conflict in Syria, for example, the conflict there is causing a lot of its inhabitants to flee the country, and that country has a total of 70% of its population currently living in poverty. Inequality, of course, is a factor because different resources have been unequally accessible for different groups. Poor education. Don't even get me started on that factor because we could literally be here for hours. The fact that we live in one of the most modernized countries and people still don't have equal access to high quality education is insane. Climate change also is a major cause for poverty. Lack of infrastructure. Unlimited capacity of the government, which basically means that not all countries have the sustainability to provide social welfare programs like the US. And this isn't to say that the social welfare programs in the US are used to the best of their abilities, because they aren't. It's just an overall comparison. And lastly, lack of reserves, meaning that many people don't have the means to weather unexpected events in their lives, like droughts or unanticipated illnesses. They can cause an even bigger financial burdens on families if they can even afford to cover the costs. In Ethiopia, repeated cycles of drought have been heavy burdens on different families. Some will even pull their children out of school and sell everything they have to help offset feeding costs. Now, I realize that's a lot of information, but I think it's extremely important to highlight the root causes of why so many people, specifically in America, are so poor. Because it's not just for a lack of laziness or stupidity that some people like to attribute poor people to having. There are actually government systems set in place that keep poor people remaining poor and the rich remaining rich. All of these culminating factors go to show just how access to different resources all can have a negative or positive impact on the financial stability of a person. Not only that, the overall emotional toll of being poor is exhausting, to say the least. Shame, being one of the most persistent attributes of poverty, is honestly one feeling that can truly be felt and understood by those that have grown up in a poor household. With all of the different factors mentioned, adding race, ethnicity, gender, citizenship status, and other identifying characteristics, the wealth gap significantly widens. In 2014, the median net worth for non-Hispanic white household was $130,800. For Black people, it was $9,590. For Hispanics, it was $17,530. And Native Americans haven't even been measured since 2002. But in 2002, it was reported to be $5,700. That is so extremely low. In contrast, for Asian American households, their median wealth gap is higher than that of white houses. Yet, within that minority group, there is a significant gap in wealth, being that the richest Asian Americans hold 168 times more wealth than the poorest. The wealth gap even persists amongst those that have a higher level of education. Black families with professional degrees or graduate degrees have $200,000 less in wealth than similarly educated white people. To be Black or brown in this country automatically puts you at a socioeconomic disadvantage because so many of our parents or those placed to take care of us often fall into the categories above. Research literally shows that the greatest correlation of high income is the educational attainment of one's parents. Yet, even when you get the same educational status as your white counterparts, you're still at a disadvantage. To think of wealth in America means to automatically think of those considered to be a part of the 1%. To be considered a part of this affluent group, a family's minimum income has to be $421,926. In more affluent areas like New York City or San Francisco, that number is even bigger. And guess what's the average income for the other 99%? $50,107. if you're even lucky enough to be making that much. In 2015, the Economic Policy Institute reported that the families of the top 1% earned 26.3% more on average than the bottom 99%. That is fucking insane to me that so many people could be living below their means in comparison to a small group that is living well above theirs. A society based on capitalism, nepotism, elitism, and the continual systemic oppression of marginalized communities will only allow those at the top to stay there. Now, I am by no means well versed on economics and how they work. You should have seen me in high school, AP economics, not my class. But I just think it's worthwhile to discuss potentially the different taxes that could be implemented in order to lift this heavy burden off poor people and marginalized communities. Not only that, the moral obligation of those that are wealthy, I think that needs to be addressed too.
The United States has a problem with income inequality.
Things are much worse today in terms of inequality than they were 30 years ago.
The biggest threat to us as a nation is income inequality.
People have different ideas about why this is happening.
CEO pay climbs every single year without exception.
The United States has lost 5 million manufacturing jobs since the year 2000.
Big shifts that's happened in the economy that has led in part to a decline in union membership.
But one of the biggest drivers of inequality is hiding here in these 2,000 pages. It's the U.S. tax code. President Trump and Republicans in Congress have a plan to alter that code. And if they get their way, it'll get even better for the richest Americans. First, let's look at a few things that Trump and the Republicans don't want to change about the tax code: the charitable deduction and the mortgage interest deduction. Here's how they favor the rich. Let's say Dan makes a $100 donation to his church. He makes about $30,000 a year, roughly the median income for individuals in the US, which puts him in the 15% tax bracket. It means he would save, at most, $15 on his taxes. But let's say Dan's boss, Steve, makes the same donation to his church. Steve makes $500,000 a year, which puts him in the top tax bracket. And the same $100 donation could save Steve $39.60 on his taxes. Dan and Steve give the same amount to their church, but Steve saves more than twice as much. The higher your tax rate, the more the charitable deduction helps you. Small examples like this add up. People making $100,000 or more account for about 57% of all the charitable contributions in the US, but they get 76% of the tax benefits. This deduction is also really expensive. The US spends $70 billion a year on it, more than 8 times what it spends on Head Start, the federally funded preschool program, and more than twice what it spends on Pell Grants for low-income students to go to college. Plus, there's all kinds of ways to bend the rules. Billionaire Mitchell Rales gets a tax break for donating his collection of modern art to a museum that he built right next door to his house, a museum that's only open for private tours. But the worst thing about the charitable deduction? There's not great evidence that it works.
Turns out you don't need a tax break to encourage people to be generous to others. In the 1980s, the top tax rate for the richest people was 70%, and through a series of reforms, it dropped to 28%. And the Council on Foundations, is kind of the trade group for charities, said, oh my God, you do that, we're going to lose all our contributions. Guess what? No difference. People gave just as much with a much lower tax rate.
Austria, Finland, Ireland, Italy, Sweden, Switzerland, and New Zealand have all gotten rid of their deductions for charitable contributions, and that hasn't had an impact on donation rates. One easy way to make things more fair? Replace the tax deduction with a tax credit. If Dan and Steve both give $100 to their church, give them each a $15 tax credit. That's how they do it in Canada. A tax credit reduces the amount you owe, so the same donation gets the same benefit, no matter how rich you are. There's another tax deduction that's a boon for the wealthy:
The mortgage interest deduction costs about $100 billion a year to the Treasury. We could use that money to treat wounded veterans, to build hospitals, to build highways, but instead we give it to rich homeowners.
Here's how it works. Let's say Dan buys a house for $100,000. He doesn't pay for that all at once. Each month he writes a check to the bank for $1,000. Let's say $800 goes to paying for the house, and the bank keeps $200. That's interest. Dan writes 12 of these checks a year, so he pays $2,400 a year in interest. The mortgage interest deduction lets Dan subtract that interest from his taxable income, which could save him as much as $362. Nice, thinks Dan. That is, until he hears about Steve. Steve also buys a house for $100,000. He also writes a $1,000 check each month, paying $200 in interest. So after a year, Steve can also deduct the $2,400 from his taxable income. But that same deduction can save Steve more than $960, nearly 3 times as much as Dan for the exact same mortgage payments. It doesn't stop there. Steve can buy a second home, deduct the interest, and save even more. Or he can get a mortgage for his yacht, count it as a second home, and deduct the interest. Sorry, Dan, your fishing boat doesn't count. There are deductions everywhere. The money you lose from gambling? Deduct it. Fancy business dinners? Yep. Money you put in a retirement account? That too. You can even deduct the fees you pay an accountant to help you find more deductions. And while theoretically Dan could take advantage of these same deductions, the fact is people like Steve benefit a whole lot more. People who make about $400,000 a year or more make up about 5% of taxpayers, but they get more than half the benefits from these tax deductions. Now, there's a third part of the tax code that Trump and the Republicans want to keep, and it's even better for the richest Americans than all of these deductions: the preferred rate for capital gains. Here's how it works. According to the U.S. tax code, there are 2 different kinds of income.
Earned income is when you go to work and somebody pays you a salary or a wage, a paycheck. That's earned income. And we have a whole set of income tax rates for that income that go up to 39.6%.
This is where Dan and Steve's tax rates come from.
Unearned income means guys who trade paper, guys who sell stock or buy commodities and then sell it. Invest in real estate properties and then sell them. That's capital income, and we tax that at a lower rate.
Let's say Steve earns $500,000 a year as a surgeon, and Lori earns the same amount as a hedge fund manager. Even though their income is the same, Steve's tax rate is 39.6%, but Lori's tax rate is nearly half that, 23.8%. So Steve ends up with a much higher tax bill. This is why billionaire investor Warren Buffett pays a lower tax rate than his secretary. His money comes from capital gains, while hers comes from a salary.
Debbie works just as hard as I do, and she pays at twice the rate I pay.
Ronald Reagan thought the same thing.
Reagan had been a very high bracket taxpayer. In fact, he paid at the 90% rate in the 1950s. He was a movie star. His accountant kept telling him, well, sign these documents and that'll shift your income from labor to capital income. And Reagan saw that was hokey. Why should that be?
Reagan's landmark 1986 tax bill taxed capital income and labor income at the same rate.
In theory, some of those loopholes were understandable, but in practice, they sometimes made it possible for millionaires to pay nothing, while a bus driver was paying 10% of his salary, and that's crazy.
There is no reason that people in such a modern and developed country should be living impoverished. And the people that are implementing these policies that are keeping those at the bottom should really take a look at themselves and think, well, what if this was me? I think that could first go a long way, and then actually implement policies and laws that are beneficial not just to one dominant group. So, how do we close the wealth gap? We begin by shifting to more progressive taxation policies, which would place heavier taxes on the wealthy and lift that burden from those at the bottom. We implement equitable policies in education. I mean, come on, our education standards are so minimal. We have to do better. We raise the minimum wage to a livable one because honestly, y'all, who the fuck can live off of $7.50 an hour? These are just a few ideas that could help shrink this enormous gap that truly should not even be in the first place, since we're such a powerhouse country with a multitude of resources and different entities that honestly are just being allocated to the dominant groups in our society. Period. I hope this episode was informative and thought-provoking for all that listen and for those that will listen in the future. I hope that our society begins moving towards more progressive laws and policies surrounding socioeconomic status, instead of the mediocre and very biased ones we have today. I hope that we all learn to be more kind and gentle with those that struggle greatly financially, because until you know how it feels, you will never honestly understand how daunting and overwhelming it is to be poor. Tolerance is not the only thing we should strive to have, but full acceptance of others that may be different from us. Remember, all of these opinions are my own, but this one especially should be everyone else's. Have a woke Wednesday. Thank you for another Woke Wednesday. Transcripts of entire episodes will be available on the Woke Wednesday website. Episodes are written and produced by Hannah Mason and Trey Leonard of Linico Entertainment. Episodes are hosted by Hannah Mason and edited by Trey Leonard. All graphics are designed by Anna French.